Okay, so for activity 7, we're going to do some review of the memory processes from the previous chapter prior to your test before we move on to the next chapter on knowledge. And we're going to dive specifically more into encoding, remembering, which is retrieval, and all of the different types of errors that our memory can make. So it's going to be an interactive lecture, much similar to your other Edpuzzle videos, since everyone seemed to be pretty big fans of those. So by now you should be relatively familiar with this information processing model and diagram that we've been building throughout the session. Prior to test 1, we focused a lot on getting up to working memory, and then we discussed working memory and long-term memory kind of separately, just as concepts. So now we want to focus on the processes that are responsible for encoding information from working memory into long-term memory, and then retrieving information that we've stored out of long-term memory back into working memory so that we can use it for thinking and problem solving. So let's put this back in the analogy of the computer. So remember that we discussed working memory being very similar to your desktop computer. It has all of the information open. It can only handle a certain amount of information at a time, and it's processing and thinking about all that information. Similar to working on a Word document or working in your Canvas, right? And so what encoding is it's storing the information that's on your desktop or in your working memory into long-term memory. And so you can literally think of this as storing a file on your computer. And so if you were to shut down your desktop, all your information that you haven't stored would be lost when you reopened or turned back on your computer, right? You have to encode that information into long-term memory or store that information in a computer file, to use that analogy, so that you can access it later on. And so encoding is simply the idea of saving the information that's in your working memory into long-term memory. And so remember that we're conceptualizing long-term memory as a very complex network of information, and all of the related information is connected to each other right now with what we're just looking at as lines, right? But when we encode information into long-term memory, no piece of information is really an island on itself, right? All the information that you're learning right now in this course and throughout your everyday life is complex, and it's got a lot of details associated with it, right? So what it really looks like when we encode information into long-term memory is there are lots of little pieces of information and details and little side parts about it. So say right now we are learning about how memory is a network. You're not just going to encode that one piece of information into your long-term memory. Rather, there's a lot of other stuff that you're encoding about that information right now as well. So we're talking about memory as a network, but you're also encoding more content details about it. So we're learning that long-term memories are connected and to related information through these lines, right? You're encoding that LTM stands for long-term memory as we practice and get used to using that acronym. So other details about the content itself, but you're also encoding details about what's going on while you're learning. So you're encoding information about where you're encoding that information. So say you're doing this in your living room. That little detail will get connected and encoded in with that memory. Where this information came from. So you will encode the detail that I'm telling you this information, or that you learned it in your cognitive psychology class. It'll also be tied to probably an image. So maybe you're going to encode a detail about what one of those networks might look like as a visual representation. And so you're encoding a lot of small details about the information, also context and information about what's going on around you as you're learning. And so all of these things are connected. And the idea is that we're going to process this information and store it into long-term memory. And again, we're trying to situate it into a little network of this new information into a larger network of information that's already in your working memory. So you want to put all of this in there. And so how we really do that to encode information is that we connect the new information with the information or prior knowledge that's already in your working memory. And so you have to make connections between what you're learning and what you already know. And so you probably find that in a lot of your classes, and hopefully I do this, that your teachers and professors are trying to get you to relate information together. Because that's essentially how it's going to hook into your long-term memory and become stored there. And so we're making connections with this old information in the seafoam green to this new information in the orange. So as we're continuing to look at these network models with all the nodes and the lines, what I want you to start looking at these lines as are memory traces. And so we're going to consider these to be memory traces. And they actually exist. We can see these at the microscopic level. Memory traces are most likely literally neural connections. And so when information is activated together, your neurons fire together and they wire together. And so these are actually neural networks in your head. So each memory is located in neurons, and then those neurons are connected. And so these are all memory traces. So the important thing to know about memory traces is that they're all going to vary in strength. Some memory traces are going to be stronger, and some memory traces are going to be weaker. Stronger memory traces are easier to activate and thus remember and retrieve. And so we went over levels of processing in the textbook reading a chapter or two ago, and this relates directly to this idea of memory traces and how they might vary in strength. So what can cause some information to have a strong memory trace, a thick line here, and to be easy to remember, and what causes some information to have a weak memory trace and to be very hard to remember and easy to forget? So it really depends on how deeply we encode this information. So we can encode it deeply, which we refer to as deep processing. You'll see over here that these lines got much thicker. And so these, you can think of this as a highway, okay, versus a small two-lane road. Information that has been deeply processed will be encoded with very strong memory traces, which means, again, it'll be very easy to activate and very easy to retrieve and remember. So what makes something deeply processed versus not so deeply processed? Well, information that's personally relevant is kind of automatically deeply processed. And so if you make what you're learning relevant to you, that will be encoded more deeply than something else. There's also information that's just adaptive for us to know and learn, and that's also deeply processed. So information that has to do with staying alive or reproducing or eating or that occurs during stressful times, that will be deeply processed. But usually what's deeply processed is information that we relate to a lot of our prior knowledge. So the more memory traces here you build and the more connections that you make, the more deeply you're going to process that information, and the stronger the memory traces are going to be. And so essentially it's just a much stronger memory and it's easier to remember. So we need to make it personally relevant, and you need to tie it in with your prior knowledge and what you already know. You need to fit it in with the stuff that's already there. On the flip side, shallow processing is really just the surface information. It's just memorizing stuff. It's not really relevant to your prior knowledge. You'll see that these lines here got much thinner, and there's also fewer of them, right? So these are weak memory traces. They're going to be very hard to retrieve, and they're also going to be forgotten much quicker. And so if you're just memorizing a definition, so the literal words in a definition, that would be shallow processing, and you're probably going to forget it very quickly or perhaps not even remember it in the first place. Whereas if you really learn the meaning of the word and try to relate it to what you already know in your personal life, then you're going to have much deeper processing, and it'll be much easier to remember because it's more deeply embedded in your long-term memory network. So regardless of how strong the initial memory trace is, whether it's deeply processed or pretty shallow, every time you're able to activate and retrieve a memory, the memory trace for that activation gets stronger. And so it's almost exactly the same as a muscle. Every time you work out a muscle, it builds more fibers on that muscle, and the muscle gets stronger, and it's more efficient and works better, right? So every time you access a memory and activate it, you're literally strengthening the memory trace. You're building more connections between neurons, and that memory trace gets stronger, which means it's much easier to activate, much easier to recall information, and it's also more resistant to forgetting. As I mentioned before, memories that are encoded during high arousal or high emotion are usually automatically deeply processed by the amygdala. And that's adaptive because we need to remember and learn from things that are occurring during times of high stress. So if something's happening with high emotion, you're afraid or incredibly sad or incredibly aroused in some other way, those memory traces are automatically going to be very strong and deeply processed and thus very easy to remember. So we discussed encoding. Remember, it essentially is just taking this new information that's in working memory and connecting it to what's already in your long-term memory. That's how we deeply process that information and encode it in a way that we'll be able to remember it later. Again, it's just like saving a file on your computer. But there's another thing that occurs after we put that information and encode it into long-term memory. And we have to go through this process of consolidation, which you also read about in your text. Essentially, consolidation occurs while you're sleeping. It's your brain organizing all of the newly encoded information that came in that day. It's organizing it and strengthening those memory traces and making all of that more permanent. And this is thanks to your hippocampus. It's very busy while you're sleeping. This is one of the theories behind dreams, that dreams are kind of the byproduct of our brain consolidating memories and revisiting things and organizing everything that we experienced and learned for that day. Without consolidating information, stuff that you encode into working memory essentially just gets a short-term save, and it will be very easy to forget later on, which we see in amnesic patients who encode new information, but it will quickly be forgotten out of long-term memory. So essentially, if you can't consolidate information while you're sleeping, you can't really store long-term memories. And so if we revisit this conceptualization of this new information in the green or blue, however it looks in your computer, and this previous information, your long-term memory over here in the orange, we're encoding it deeply by attaching and associating the information in working memory to the information in long-term memory, creating hooks to store that into long-term memory. And then after you go to sleep, what happens is it all becomes part of the same network. The connections between them get stronger, and they become one spider web. Instead of, two spider webs on top of each other, it's all getting reorganized together so that it can work more efficiently. And so consolidation is an incredibly important process. And this is why we emphasize spaced practice. If you want to think of practice as studying or learning, so spacing out learning and studying over time rather than doing it all at once. We've been told our entire lives not to cram, and while oftentimes that's necessary, due to time constraints, cramming is terrible for your memory, because every time you learn something and then sleep, your memory for that information gets stronger as that information consolidates, the memory traces become stronger, and the organization becomes more efficient. And so rather than practicing or studying for 5 hours in one night and then letting that information consolidate one time while you sleep, the one night before the test perhaps, it's much better to practice a little while over 5 nights, and each time going to sleep and letting that information consolidate. You can actually study much less time if you interweave it across days and around sleep. And so sleeping is really important. If you study before a test without sleeping, say the same day before you take your test on Sunday, you might be able to spit back out the information for the test by just trying to rehearse it and keep it in your working memory, but you're not going to remember it the next day. And so if you want to remember the stuff over the long term and really get your money's worth when it comes to college, we really need to be spacing things apart across sleep and distributing your practice and studying time. So we've talked about this idea of encoding, talked about the idea of consolidation, so really setting it more in stone into long-term memory where we can use it over the long haul. And now we need to talk about retrieval. So retrieval is essentially just the process of activating that information in long-term memory. Remember, we can activate things just by thinking of them and through effort. And then we activate it in long-term memory, and then that kind of naturally brings it back into working memory for processing. So we're getting the information out of long-term memory so that we can use it in working memory to think about things and problem solve. Again, these long-term memories with stronger memory traces that were deeply encoded are going to be much easier to retrieve because they're much easier to activate. And as we activate one thing in working memory, that activation is going to spread through memory traces to other associated things. And so we're able to retrieve other related information as well. But the really important part about retrieving information from long-term memory is that once we get that information from long-term memory and we bring it back into working memory, it's also mixed in with new information, right? So we're bringing in our long-term memory, but we're also doing other things during that time that's in working memory. Everything that's going on in your environment is in your working memory. Any new information that you're processing is in working memory. And so all of those are going to get mixed together into your working memory, essentially, if you want to think of it as a soup. What this results in is either intentional or unintentional editing. And so you bring that old information, prior knowledge in from working memory, and it's getting mixed in with all of this new information and current events that's going on in your environment. And so you're essentially adding in information and details to that previous memory. Through that, we can strengthen the information that we were retrieving and thinking about in working memory, while not strengthening the other information that you didn't retrieve and weren't working on. But more so, we look at this as being reconstructive, okay? And so every time you bring information from your long-term memory into your working memory, you're editing it. You're creating a new version of it. You're adding information to it. You are focusing and highlighting on some information while possibly not others. So when we recall a memory, you're remembering all of the times you remembered it. You're remembering that original memory along with all of the information that got added to it during any other time that you activated it and remembered it. So you're putting all the pieces together from all of the edits, drafts, or versions of that long-term memory. Every time you've activated that long-term memory in your working memory, essentially it's a new draft. It's just like, again, the computer. So you have, say a paper you're working on in a class. Every time you open it, you do some stuff to it, and then you save it, right? And then when you go back to get that paper again, when you reopen it, you're opening the most recently saved version. So let's say that you don't really have the original. In this memory analogy, you don't have the original draft. You only have the most recent one. And that most recent one has all of the information and all of the work from all of the previous times that you've worked on it. So you're not really remembering that original memory. Remember, that memory is not like a audio recording or a video recording. It's not like watching a movie of the original event. You are remembering your last remembering of that memory. So you're remembering the last memory you had of it, the most recent draft. So we call it reconstructive. And because of this, this means that our memory can actually be very inaccurate since we're putting together all of the information and trying to decide what originally happened. We often don't notice the changes that have occurred as we've been remembering this information over multiple times. So it's really hard to remember the original one. That leads to us having a number of problems, not necessarily problems, but weaknesses or shortcomings in our memory. And these are all totally normal. So people with the best memories have high metacognition. I used to think I had a terrible memory. I've heard this in students and friends alike, that I just have a terrible memory. But really, people with the best memory are simply the people with the best metacognition. And that is that they first know how memory works, and so they know how to deeply encode important information. They know that they're not going to remember something simply by looking at it. They know that they need to make meaningful connections and really deeply process that information and connect it to themselves and what they already know. Almost more importantly, people with high metacognition are aware of the common memory errors and shortcomings of our memories that come naturally to everyone. And so to increase all of your metacognition, what we're going to do is we're going to go over the 7 sins of memory now. So all of the issues that everyone has with their memory are essentially these 7 things. These are totally normal. And we can look at these as side effects of what is actually a very strong memory. Remember that our long-term memory is essentially unlimited. We can learn an unlimited amount. And we also have a very efficient information processing model that's going on in our head. We're filtering out unimportant information at every stage. And so as a result, we have these kind of side effects that occur, and they end up being weaknesses in our memory. And so we're going to go over all of these now, one by one, with examples. And these are all things that you experience in your everyday life. So transience is just a fancy cognitive psychology word for forgetting. It's essentially the decreasing accessibility to a memory over time. And so we've been talking about memory traces. Some of them are strong, some of them are weak, depending on how we encode it, right? Regardless, your memory trace is going to slowly and eventually decay over time if it's not activated. Again, we can look at memory traces just like a muscle. If you do not use a muscle, your body is going to start to eat it and use the energy from it, and it's going to get weaker and eventually go away so that you can't even use it anymore. So a memory trace is the same way. If you don't activate that information, that memory trace is slowly going to decay and get weaker and weaker and weaker until you can't retrieve the memory anymore. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's gone. Research has not proven that yet, but rather that the trace is so weak that you can't use it to get there. It would be like a road that no one had tended to, in 500 years, and now it's been overgrown with trees and other stuff so that you can't drive a car through it anymore. So if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. That's a real thing in memory research. And so if we're looking at this illustration of some long-term memory for associated information, we see that these lines are relatively thick. But say you learn something in one of your classes and you don't really use it in your everyday life and you never activate or think about that information again. Over time, weeks, days, maybe years, it's going to get weaker and weaker until eventually that memory trace is so weak that you can't activate that information anymore to bring it back into working memory. And so transience is totally normal. You will forget less. The stronger a memory trace is, it'll be less prone to forgetting, right? But everything will decay if you don't use it and activate that memory trace. So if we were to illustrate transience in your information processing model, really it's an issue here with retrieval, and that you can't retrieve it because that memory trace is just too weak. The next sin of memory that we all experience on a daily basis is absent-mindedness. So this is a relatively broad term that we've mentioned before. But really, absent-mindedness is when the information doesn't get encoded in the first place. And so you can't retrieve that information from working memory because you never encoded and stored it in there in the first place. So this might be because you weren't paying attention to something and never even brought it into working memory. Or it could be that you brought something into working memory and got distracted and it fell out of working memory, never got encoded. Or it could be that you just tried to process something in working memory so shallowly that you didn't process it deep enough that it never ended up getting encoded into your working memory. And so we have lots of examples of this every day. Forgetting where you put your car keys when you got home because you dropped them and weren't paying attention. So when you go back to remember, that information isn't in working memory because you never stored it. forgetting why you walked into the kitchen, not fully attending to a lecture. You can go to classes all day long, but if you don't pay attention and really focus on that information and try to deeply process it, you're still not going to do well on the test, right? So this sin of memory is really when it comes to us being absent-minded and never encoding the information in long-term memory in the first place. And so all the orange areas here are essentially all the places where this can occur. It can be that we didn't pay attention to something and bring it into working memory. It can be that we didn't process it in working memory, or we got distracted and it fell out, or it could be that we just didn't encode it deeply enough to get it into long-term memory in the first place. But either way, it never gets over here. The third typical memory error that we'll talk about is blocking. And this is also, I experience this a couple times a week. I think some other people might experience it more or less, but it's the temporary inaccessibility to stored information. And so it's what you know as the tip of the tongue phenomenon. And so what's important about this is that this is the feeling that you know something, that you have a memory and that it's there, and you're aware that you know it, but you just can't remember it or gain access to it. And so this is an issue in spreading activation. It could be that you are not activating information that's closely related enough to what you're trying to think of. And so the activation can't spread through that memory node to get there. Or it could be that that information you're trying to think of has a very weak memory trace and that activation just can't quite get there. So examples of this might be trying to think a word while you're writing can't think of a specific word that's on the tip of your tongue while you're writing a paper or speaking. Can't remember the name of someone that you remember that you met last week. Say you see someone in a different environment and you recognize their face, but you just can't remember where you know them from. And again, in all of these examples, you have this strong feeling that you know, that you have the information in memory, but you just can't access it. And so if we were to illustrate this on the information processing model here, see that we have this information activated in long-term memory, but this gray part here is the information that you're looking for. And so you're aware that it's there, but you just can't get the activation to spread to it. And you'll probably notice, if you really think about what you do when you're trying to think of a tip of the tongue piece of information that you can't access, what is it that you do to try to help yourself remember? Well, usually you just try to start thinking about other related things. And we do this incidentally, but really what we're trying to do is we're trying to activate all the information around it as much as possible so that we could hopefully get that activation to spread to the one piece of information that you're looking to retrieve. The fourth sin of memory is suggestibility. So these next two are going to ring very familiar with the activity from last week. So suggestibility is a type of false memory, and it's the incorporation of new but inaccurate information into a memory that you already have. So remembering that long-term memory is reconstructive. So when you bring a long-term memory into working memory, we're mixing it in the pot, we're mixing new information in with it, right? Sometimes we mix in inaccurate information without really realizing it. And so when you go back to recall or retrieve that memory later, you'll pull out all of the information and you won't be aware that the incorrect information that you more recently added and encoded in with it is incorrect. You just won't be cognizant of that. So we usually cannot remember the sources of each detail that came or each piece of that information that's associated with that memory. We learned all of those things oftentimes in different places, and so we consider this a source error. In this instance, the source error would be thinking that the information was from the original event, but it actually came afterwards through a suggestion from someone else or to exposure to other inaccurate information after the fact. So let's talk about some examples of this. Leading questions by police. And so if I'm asking you to recall what happened when you were in the 7-Eleven and you witnessed a robbery, and I provided suggestions about information that you didn't provide. So saying, what hand was he holding the gun in? What happens is that new information will get incorporated with the actual memory that you're recalling in working memory, and it all get blended together. And then later on, you will be more likely to recall a detail about a gun being in a hand. You won't remember that the police suggested suggested that detail to you, or rather it's just going to come and be retrieved with all that other information. It's very hard for us to distinguish. So you might inaccurately believe that you saw him holding a gun, even though it's really just suggested by the police in a question. Another example might be details that someone else told you, but that you thought you saw or experienced yourself. And so your friend tells you about this one time that she went to Washington, D.C. and, fell and hit her head. As you incorporate that into your memory, you might continue to tell that to someone. And the more you retell that, you might forget the actual source of that memory. Another example is reading a blog article online and then thinking you learned it in your psychology class. And so we're being exposed to a lot of information on the internet daily, and not all of it is from reputable sources, right? But unfortunately, we are very poor at remembering the source of information. So if you read something about metacognition online, it's going to get incorporated into your long-term memory and your knowledge about metacognition. And even if you read it on some bogus blog that was written by a 3-year-old, it's going to be recalled with all of your other knowledge that you learned in school anyways. And so this is confusing the source of where that came from. We see suggestibility and misinformation a lot during lineup procedures. So you can confuse where you saw a face. So say you were mugged by someone and they give you a photo array to look at to see if you recognize any of the faces. You might recognize the face and identify that as the perp that mugged you, but really you recognize that face because you saw that man just prior in the drugstore while shopping. And so while the memory is real, you actually recognize the face and you did see him, you've just confused where you saw him. And in this example, this is suggestibility because they provided you with that information. So they suggested that face and then you later remembered it. So if we were going to look at suggestibility on our information processing network, we could look at it as having this information already in long-term memory, and then taking a new piece of inaccurate information, encoding it, a suggestion, encoding it in with all that information, and then you'll retrieve it and remember it all together without remembering where all the different pieces came from. Along the same line, another type of false memory is a larger grain false memory of misattribution. So that's believing that you experienced something that you didn't because you incorrectly attributed a memory, the source of that memory. So it's another type of source error. But this is for an entire event, not just a detail that was incorrectly incorporated in with a memory that's inaccurate. This is an entire memory that you have and you ended up thinking actually happened to you even though it didn't. And so we also call this reality monitoring error. It's when we have a hard time monitoring whether it happened in reality or whether it happened in our head or to someone else. So perhaps you were imagining something and you thought it actually happened later on, or something was told you by someone else and you thought it happened later on to you. You saw something on TV, and then several years later, you thought perhaps it happened to you. You had a very vivid dream, and then you woke up, and several days later, you have a hard time remembering whether that actually happened or whether you just dreamed it. So the examples of this can go on and on. But it's that we have this entire memory, and we're just confusing the source of the information as having come from a personal experience instead of something else. And so examples of this are the famous repressed memory abuse scenarios that we heard a little about in Dr. Loftus's TED Talk last week. And so what happened in the 1980s when therapists and counselors were still very much into Freudian theory, which expressed the fact that our unconscious is doing a lot of thinking and processing, and it affects us in a great way. And there's a lot of stuff going on underneath the surface that we're not aware of. One of those things that Freud and then subsequent therapists thought that was happening was that our unconscious was hiding memories for traumatic things that happened to us. So it's burying them away so that we're not even aware that they occurred at all. And that even though they're buried away, they might be still negatively affecting us, even though we're not aware. And so when someone went into therapy, what would happen is the therapist would, if they came with a complaint that couldn't be easily explained, say someone's depressed, but they don't really have a good reason to be depressed, nothing's going on in their life that would warrant this depression, or say they have trouble sleeping, but there is no real reason, obvious reason, why they shouldn't be able to sleep. Therapists would insinuate that there's probably something repressed in their consciousness that they need to unearth. And so they would try to uncover these repressed memories through imagining procedures. And so they would suggest stories to these people, and they would have them vividly imagine these stories in their head over and over again, adding details each time. And so as they're imagining these stories, they're encoding them into memory. And then later on, they're vividly remembering these stories, but they're remembering them as actually having happened, instead of remembering them just as they're being their imaginations. And so they're confusing the source. The source was them creating that image and that story in their head by imagining it, but they're thinking that it actually happened. And so this happened a great deal, and we'll provide a little bit more information on that if you're interested at the end of the talk. You heard about some other examples that were very easily produced in laboratory settings by Elizabeth Loftus. So simply just telling someone a story, putting the idea in their head, and then asking about it later. A lot of the time they'll remember it as having actually happened, especially if we ask them to imagine it or create details for it. So telling some people that they were lost in the mall as a child and telling them the story, they then remember that story as having actually happened. So if we were to look at this misattribution on the information processing, we see that we're encoding this new information in working memory into long-term memory, and we're encoding the source as being something other than our reality, something other than our personal experience. But then when we go and remember it, we're mistakenly remembering the source as having actually happened to us or being from a personal experience. So misattribution and suggestibility may seem very similar, and they are very similar concepts. They're both types of false memories. They're both due to source errors. Essentially, they're just false memories at different grain sizes. So suggestibility is incorporating an accurate detail into an authentic memory. So just one small piece of information gets incorporated with an accurate memory or true information, whereas misattribution is incorporating an entire story in that didn't happen to you and then confusing the source as having actually happened to you. The last, second to last kind of memory that we'll discuss is bias. And so this essentially is the retrospective distortion of memory that's produced by your current knowledge and beliefs. And so this only has to do with autobiographical memories, so memory about yourself or things that happened to you. So our identity, our knowledge, and our beliefs change a great deal over time and over the course of our life. And so if you're trying to retrieve a memory that happened to you a long time ago, and since then your knowledge, beliefs, or your identity have changed a great deal since that original memory was encoded, you're going to retrieve that memory in a somewhat distorted way, in a way that's going to be more in line with your current self and beliefs. So some examples of this might be, say you took a course that you thought was pretty cool. We can use this course. Hopefully you're thinking this course is relatively interesting. And you enjoyed the course throughout pretty much the whole class. You thought the information was interesting, but then at the very end of the class, the professor threw a really difficult test at you that you thought was unfair, and you ended up flunking the final exam and failing the test. I promise I won't do that. It puts a really bad taste about that professor in your mouth, and you leave not liking the course or the professor. because of what happened at the end. Later, when someone goes back and asks you to remember about the course, what was that course like? Was it good? You're more likely to think that remember that the whole course was terrible, because that would align more so with your current belief that the professor and the course were unfair. You would be biased against remembering the good parts of the course because your current belief is that the course and the professor were terrible. And so you see that your memory is distorted because you're only remembering the stuff that's in line with your current knowledge. Or say you've been a vegetarian for 10 years. It's been a really long time since you've eaten meat, and someone's asking you, as they're eating lunch that day, and they're eating McDonald's, if you've ever had a McDonald's cheeseburger before, and you might say, no, I've never even had them, even though you had. Your memory might be distorted so that you're not able to retrieve some of the information about your time meat eating because it's incongruent with your current self and beliefs. And so it doesn't really align with who you are currently. And so it's very hard to retrieve those memories from before, or retrieve them accurately, at least. So not only is our memory distorted towards remembering things in a way that agree with how we currently feel and believe, our autobiographical memory is also biased towards being self-serving. So we usually can easily remember good autobiographical memories or positive memories or attributes about ourselves, and we're less likely to remember bad things about us. And so our autobiographical memory wants us to remember our best self. So we remember good things that align with our current knowledge, self, and belief. And so if we want to look at bias on this information processing model, we can see this long-term memory over the course of the life. It's going to look slightly different. Use this, the one in the background, the green circle, to demonstrate perhaps your long-term memory when you were 15, all the things you knew, all the things that you believed. Whereas this more yellow circle is all the information and beliefs you currently have now as, a 40-year-old. And so when I ask you a question about something that happened when you were, say, 15, you are more likely to recall the answer to that question in a way that aligns with your current knowledge and beliefs without going into your original 15-year-old self and getting all the details from the original memory. The last bin of memory is persistence. So persistence is unwanted recollections that intrude when you're not trying to remember something, or you even don't want to remember something. And so we see this typically with emotional memories because they get encoded so deeply that they're very easy to activate. And so the typical example of this is a flashback with post-traumatic stress disorder. The memories that are associated with the traumatic event are encoded incredibly deeply, and they develop very strong memory traces to a lot of things. Those memory traces are so strong that they can be triggered by things that are even very weakly related. And so persistence is the recalling of these memories even when you don't want to and you're not trying to. And so if we were to illustrate this on the info processing model, really this is just frequent and unwanted activation and retrieval of certain memories. So let's make one clarification, since we've just talked about two types of false memories, about repressed memories, which you read about at the end of your book. I make this clarification because this is the most persistent misconception that students often have, since we've all, most of the time, grown up seeing on TV and hearing about repressed memories. So just learn that most traumatic memories, especially when PTSD is involved, are persistent. They're encoded very deeply, they're very easily activated and remembered. Yet, it's not uncommon to hear of someone that says they weren't able to remember a traumatic event, or that it's hard for them to remember a traumatic event or something that happened. And so before, that was explained by the idea of repressed memories, but there is absolutely no research that indicates repression occurs or is even possible. Absolutely no research. So how do we explain it? Well, let me backtrack and define a repressed memory. A repressed memory, again, would be an unpleasant memory that your unconscious buried so that you are no longer aware of it, okay? But in the Fortean idea, it might still be negatively affecting you, but it's kind of deep in your unconscious and you don't know it's there. What's really happening? Well, often it's a false memory and that we've implanted a memory, and so the memory wasn't repressed. It was literally never there before. It's new, and you're just confusing it as having happened earlier on in life. But now that we're aware of false memory syndrome and how that can happen, we don't do those practices in therapy anymore, so these are much, much less common. The real explanation for when people are telling you they have a hard time remembering something bad that happened to them is that it's intentional forgetting. So we can purposefully not think about something that's unpleasant. We can avoid things that remind us of something that's unpleasant, and we can kind of dissociate it ourselves so that we're never reminded of it. And so if we can prevent that memory trace from being activated, remember, if it's not activated, it's going to slowly decay. And so if you're successful at avoiding a negative memory for a long period of time, the memory trace for that will decay so much that it may feel forgotten or very hard to remember. And so that's just essentially intentional transience, okay? We're forgetting on purpose. And so the difference between intentional forgetting and repressed memory is that this is done by avoiding it on purpose, and this, or the idea of a repressed memory, would be something that your unconscious is doing all on its own that's below your conscious level of awareness. And so just to drive it home, repressed memories are not a thing and they don't exist. Intentional forgetting or things that are hard for you to recall because you've avoided thinking about it, that might very well exist. So if you think the false memory stuff is cool, or interesting rather, you can go to the False Memory Syndrome website, which has a lot of really interesting stories and court cases even about people that recovered quote unquote repressed memories in therapy, ended up suing or placing criminal charges against the person who was abusing them in that fake repressed memory, and how that all panned out. Most of those people have all recanted now, and so there's a lot of interesting stories, court cases, and research on that site if you want to find out some more. So we've gone over all of these memory processes. So just to recap, talked about working memory. We take that information, we encode that new information into long-term memory. We sleep on it, and while we're sleeping, it becomes consolidated, organized, and it develops stronger memory traces within your long-term memory. And then you can retrieve that information from long-term memory whenever you need it for thinking and use it in working memory. And then it will then get, the reiteration of that will then get re-encoded back into long-term memory.